Well, without getting too deep into those discussions, Stephen, you mentioned President Obama, and Michael, you mentioned the House makeup, if you will. What are the practical politics of this? Because it doesn't seem very clear-cut.
I don't think it's not very clean-cut. And the ability for this Congress to work with this administration when there's just not a high level of trust in terms of the negotiations, it's going to be extremely difficult. What I will say, though, is right now there are opportunities for smaller fixes, because whereas you've had this kind of constant struggle and gridlock that's been going on, it's almost created this constant state of political warfare that's gotten to such a macro level that smaller things are starting to go through. Modifications on hydro, modifications on geothermal. There are opportunities for things to get done, which that actually builds a working relationship between Murkowski and Wyden, and showing an ability to negotiate and actually put some of these reforms out there that will make it more technology neutral. Because that is one of the things that Wyden has said that he wants to do, is move away from this selecting this industry over that industry and moving into more of a flat technology neutral policy. And that's positive.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that that's the inherent problem with, the federal government getting involved in this space in the first place is, people are lining up at the door, and the cronyism that's going on is distorting the marketplace. And as we ramp up these sources into the grid without really having a good knowledge of what the ramifications are going to be with respect to negative pricing and the other implications, I'm talking electricity in particular, we're in for a rude awakening when down the road, if our economy ever does pick up, God willing, and we need a lot more energy to power our manufacturing base and to keep up to the demand for job creation in homes and everything else, when we idle coal plants artificially, arbitrarily, to make up for this increase in these other sources without really knowing what the ramifications are. So I just think that the answer is we need to purify the system a little bit as opposed to try and making it better. We really need to wind out of this, because the answer is that it's created this web of pet energy sources, du jour, depending on the president, depending on the industry that's positioned himself or herself for those federal bucks, as opposed to what's best for the consumer.
I was going to just add one thing. One thing I object to in this debate is when people call oil and gas a finite resource. It is not finite, and we've certainly learned that lesson over the last 50. Look, I'm a Julian Simon disciple. Julian taught us that natural resources are not finite, that we never run out of them because all resources come from the human mind, which is infinite. And I always say I wish Julian Simon could have lived to have seen hydraulic fracturing, because what hydraulic fracturing has done is almost overnight it's quadrupled the amount of oil and gas that we have access to, and 20 years from now we'll have way more. And I'll just give you one example. The U.S. Geological Survey just recently came out with a report estimating how much oil is in North Dakota, and they did the previous survey was what, like 4 years ago, I think it was, Tom, and 4 years ago they said there was about 3 billion barrels of oil in North Dakota. Just 4 years later, now they're saying, no, there's not 3 billion, there's closer to 8 billion. So in 4 years' time, they've doubled the amount of oil and natural gas, they say, is in North Dakota. By the way, if you go back to the late 1990s, believe it or not, they said that we had about 500 million barrels of oil in North Dakota. So just in 20 years, they've increased the amount of oil that they say that we have there by about 25-fold. We're not running out of oil and gas or coal for hundreds and hundreds of years. We should call all of these resources renewable.
Stephen, you remind me of when I was at Epcot Center with my kids a few years ago, and I was going through Exxon's World of Energy, and it was a wonderful ride. And they were explaining how oil is, in fact, renewable. Remember, it's sponsored by Exxon, because it's coming from dinosaur dung that was left a million years ago. No, oil is not renewable, and it took me about 2 hours to unwind my kids from that ride. And to have to do it again is a little bit frustrating. But look, We know the consequences of our dependence on oil, which is absolutely a non-renewable resource. And we saw it a couple of years ago when oil spiked to $140 a barrel, and it put the world economy into a tailspin. That's the consequence if we don't have alternatives. And I am glad that we're getting more oil from tight oil supplies in North Dakota and whatnot. I think it's terrific. But we also need to recognize that there are potential environmental consequences of fracking. And not even asking the oil companies to report what chemicals and how much water they are using in that production is also a subsidy. And so how do you quantify the health impacts, the environmental impacts, the energy security impacts, and make sure that we have energy resources that are sustainable, that can have a meaningful impact on consumer prices today, and can keep our economy chugging along?
I take issue with the disclosure of fracking. I'm not here to defend the oil and gas industry, but I know there's several instances where they do disclose, and every state in this union regulates the technology, by the way. And I don't think that the state Department of Environmental Protections across the country have a vested interest in seeing their states' lands and waters squandered. I mean, I think you're sort of the issue though is okay. So that's not necessarily, that's a value judgment as opposed to a question of whether or not we should be using the federal government to subsidize these other technologies, or whether we should be relying on the market. So, you know, from my perspective, you could say the same thing about ethanol. What are the environmental consequences of ethanol production? What are the life cycle, you know, carbon footprint costs and all those other things? So, you know, what are the impacts of the restrictions on imports of other types of ethanol from other countries? So, you know, I just think that we need to really decide, you know, whether or not we want the federal government to be involved in these decisions and micromanage this space, or we want to start winding this stuff down. And if we agree that we want to start winding this stuff down, then we ought to get together, work together on all sides, and try and figure out the best way to do that.
Tom, I agree with you that these involve value judgments. We sit in the shadow of the Capitol, that's a lot what they do, is make these kind of value judgments. And I think it's entirely appropriate for us to be looking at the environmental consequences of oil, just as we have looked at the environmental and agricultural impacts associated with ethanol. Lord knows the oil and gas industry have made sure we've counted the angels on the head of a pin with respect to the ethanol industry, and I think we come out just fine, thank you very much. We emit far less carbon than petroleum. We are saving consumers money today. We've revitalized rural America. It has been a win-win for the consumer and the government. And you had referenced trade preferences. There are no tariffs associated with ethanol today. So this is a program that...
But do you need the mandate?
Yeah.
Do you need the mandate?
This is the problem. Let me just say some of this, because I mean, I think we're saying the same thing. But you know, you said, look, we're 10% of our gasoline, you know, our fuel is coming from ethanol and so on. Well, yeah, that's because the government requires us to get 10% of our gasoline from ethanol. Now, look, I hope you're right, Bob. You know the economics of this industry a lot better than I do. I will concede that. But if you're right that this is saving consumers money and it's economical, why in the world, I guess this is the point Tom was going to make, is why in the world do you need the federal government to mandate that I buy it? Look, I'm a consumer. I shouldn't have to buy a gallon of gasoline with ethanol in it if I don't want to.
Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is consumers don't have choices because the refiners absolutely dictate what is available to the consumer. I would like to be able to purchase more ethanol than I can today, and I'm limited to 10% because the major oil companies don't want to put in a fraction more ethanol in gasoline. They control access to the consumer. They control access to the marketplace. That's why you need to have a program that's saying, look, for all these public policy reasons, because it's better for the environment, because it's better for rural America, because it's better for our economy and our energy security, gosh darn it, we want the oil companies to be using some small percentage of renewable fuels in their mix. And the renewable fuels has done that. The renewable fuel standard has done that. and it has been extraordinarily successful. In the absence of that, refiners, they're not in the business of throughputing carbohydrates. They're in the business of throughputing hydrocarbons. And as long as they control the access to the market and they control the fuel distribution and the infrastructure, we have to have programs to level the playing field and make sure that there's some level of renewable fuels being used. It's been a great success.